So what you'll be able to gain from today is understanding a bit more about the VA's definition of veterans, some facts about suicide, most importantly, understanding what the common myths are about suicide, and understand our gatekeeper training, which is called Operation SAVE. We'll end with resources and references so that you have those as well. And this training can be delivered nationwide by suicide prevention coordinators. And I will show you at the end where you can locate someone in your area in case you know of a community that wants to have a face-to-face training, for example. So I already introduced, sorry about that. I already introduced Madrienne and myself, and so I'll just go ahead and get started. So the VA definition of veterans is any person who served honorably on active duty in the armed forces of the United States. We understand that anyone who has raised their hand to be of service, whether that's through the reserves, National Guard, or any branch of the military, otherwise is someone who in the community is observed as a veteran, and we recognize that. We think that all veterans matter, and that's why we're here today. So the Department of Veterans Affairs, where we work, we fall under the Veterans Health Administration. That's where healthcare is delivered. There's actually 3 branches, though, of the VA, and many folks don't understand that. So just wanted to clarify, there's also the Veterans Benefits Administration. This is where you would submit a claim for benefits, which would be anything from a service-related injury claim to issues around trying to acquire home loans, funeral benefits, a whole host of benefits that Congress has written into law. The third arm of the VA is the National Cemetery Administration. We have a website reference here for VA benefits, and I want to dispel a myth that you have to have certain benefit approval and certain benefits approved in order to reach out to the VHA, or the Veterans Health Administration, to start care. That's actually not the case for most veterans, especially post 9/11 veterans. If there's ever a question about whether or not you're eligible for care, all VA medical centers actually have an enrollment office. And then, of course, there are nationally county-based veteran service officers who provide a free service to be an advocate in your county. So we're here today because we have a big problem with suicide. And so I want to give you some data about suicide in the United States, which would include the civilian population as well as veterans. What we do know about suicide is that it's the 10th leading cause of death. Homicide is the 17th leading cause of death, and oftentimes folks think that that would be opposite. We hear a lot more in the media about murders than we do about suicide. But suicide is a big problem. We know that someone dies about every 12 minutes. Here's some more data about suicide, and perhaps something that some folks don't understand or have questions about is the difference between women and men when we look at suicidal behavior. We do know that women attempt suicide more often than men. That's typically because women use a lower lethality means. So what that equates to using pills for self-harm. So for example, women are more likely to overdose on medication or medication and alcohol, for example. And those overdoses, although they could be lethal, most of the time they're not. They also allow someone a lot of time after the actual suicidal behavior to reach out for help. Men die by suicide at a rate about 4 times that of women because men tend to use firearms. And over 90% of the time, if someone attempts suicide by using a firearm, they die. When we look at the entire United States, there's also some unique categories when we break down race and ethnicity. We've, for a long time, had a problem in American Indian and Alaskan Native communities where the suicide rates are very disproportionate. And so here's a breakdown of suicide rates by race and ethnicity. Some facts about veteran suicide, and I'll point out that we do have an updated data report, which was the largest suicide data report that's ever been done on veterans, and that was released August of 2016. If anyone would like a reference to that, we have it at the end. I can also send you, if you reach out to me directly, you'll have my contact information. I can send you a link to that data report. So what we know is that veterans are more likely to die than the general population using firearms when it comes to suicide. On average, there's over 700 suicide attempts a month for veterans receiving care at VA, and 25% of veterans suicide have a history of previous suicide attempts. Having survived a suicide attempt does make someone more at risk, but at the same time, we know that treatment works, and that's oftentimes the catalyst for getting someone help. We're now going to talk about very common myths and realities about suicide. This is perhaps the meat of this training, and also serves as a way for us all to kind of feel better about our knowledge when it comes to suicide and suicide prevention. Whether you've been in the field of mental health or medicine for 20 years, or you're a layperson who just wants to help and you don't really have any of that background, we tend to find that people have the same myths about suicide. And we really want your help in dispelling these myths so that not only for veterans, but for your entire community, you can be a resource. So what we know most certainly about how we talk to people regarding suicide gives us a lot of avenues that we can learn from. So for example, asking someone about suicide may lead to someone taking his or her own life. This is stated repeatedly as a reason why people don't ask someone directly if they're having thoughts of suicide, because they think that they're going to make the person have those thoughts, or that they're going to make them more at risk. What we know is that this is not true. However, when you're in that position and there's someone you care about, or there's someone who you don't know and they're your client or a neighbor, everyone feels pretty nervous about using this language, especially if you don't do it often. But asking about suicide does not create suicidal thoughts. The simple act of asking the question gives the veteran permission to talk about their feelings and their thoughts. So it's really important that when we ask this question, we do it in a way that shows compassion. We do it in a way where we're not telling the person what we want them to answer. So for example, if you're in front of someone on the app that we're here to talk about today with Objective Zero, and you can see the person on FaceTime, you don't want to use nonverbal language, for example, by shaking your head no when you're asking a yes or no question. Ways that we can all send a message of what we really want to hear is not what we're looking for. We want to show compassion and show that we care and that we have time to hear the answer. Another common myth is that people are either talking about suicide or they're just going to do it. So talkers or doers, and that because there's people that talk about it, they'll never do it, and then there's people that will do it and not talk about it. The reality is that most people who die by suicide have communicated intent, and many times have communicated intent in many ways. That could be by giving away belongings. It could be by posting something on social media. It could be by implying or stating very clearly that their life is not worth living. But someone who talks about suicide provides us with an opportunity to intervene. And that's where the work that you're doing is so valuable. And also the work that we've done here at VA has proven this time and time again. Almost everyone who dies by suicide or who makes a suicide attempt has given a clue or warning. The problem is that when we're really close to someone, so if this someone is a very close relative of yours or a close friend, sometimes it's harder to see warning signs in someone very close to us. But no matter how casual or joking someone is, if you hear, "You'll be sorry when I'm dead," or "I can't see any way out," if someone talks about feeling like a burden on others, if someone talks about feeling like they don't belong, so for example, someone in your unit all of a sudden has a kind of a shift and they talk about how they don't matter to the unit anymore, maybe they're a burden to others there, that's a sign. We see this happen at work. We'll hear coworkers call the crisis line about concerns for someone who's at work and talking about how the work that they're doing doesn't matter, that they feel like they're a burden on others, or that nobody cares. These are signs that could indicate that someone has suicidal thoughts. Another myth that's very common is if somebody really wants to die by suicide, you can't stop them, or there's nothing you can do about it. For any of us on the call, by the way, who have lost someone to suicide, this can be very difficult to negotiate after a loss. And so it makes it even harder for us in the field to dispel the myth. But here's the reality, that suicidal thoughts are associated with treatable disorders. So for example, most people in a suicidal crisis are not thinking in their best mindset. They're not having rational thoughts. It's usually secondary to some type of relationship problem, a problem with substance abuse, a struggle with depression or PTSD. And helping someone connect with treatment is life-saving. Treatment works. The acute risk for suicide is often time limited. We have various studies in the field to support this. The thoughts of suicide come fast and they feel awful and they leave fast. For some folks, they linger a bit longer, but if we actually look at our research, we can learn that actually there's oftentimes just a few minutes from the time someone has thoughts of suicide to the time that they act. If you can help someone survive that immediate crisis and overcome the strong intent to die, or what we've oftentimes now heard as responders to crisis, the strong intent to want the pain to end, then you've gone a really far way to help somebody have a positive outcome. And remember that treatment works. So some folks see warning signs in someone that they know, but another myth is that someone wouldn't actually hurt themselves because they have positive things in their life. Maybe they're a parent. Maybe they have future plans that they just made. They're really looking forward to something. Maybe there's been promises that they would never hurt themselves. All of these things have to be balanced when somebody's showing warning signs. The reality is that the intent to die is, again, not a rational thought, and it can override many other things going on in someone's life. If we all think about our most difficult time in life, we can then relate to this, that we weren't at our best self. We weren't able to see things in a way that was balanced. We were maybe stuck in emotion mind. But someone experiencing suicidal ideation must really be taken seriously, because we have to ask the person, what are those thoughts about? And there's usually a lot more behind the story. We want to get that person to a provider who can further evaluate their condition and provide treatment as appropriate. And at the same time, we can really help someone instill hope with them in the moment that treatment works. And that's not a message that we always hear. It's a message that we're trying harder and harder to push out into the community. So what Operation SAVE is, it's a gatekeeper training, which is why we're here today. It does not require any certain education or background, but it will help you have something to fall back on when you're talking to someone, especially in the platform of Objective Zero. The acronym SAVE is important to remember, and it stands for Signs of Suicidal Thinking That Should Be Recognized, Ask the Most Important Question of All, Validate the Veteran's Experience, and Encourage Treatment and Expedite Getting Help. So as we mentioned earlier, there's oftentimes warning signs. I, in my personal experience at the VA, have not heard of a death by suicide or a serious suicide attempt that did not have very clear warning signs. Sometimes we hear about those warning signs, like I mentioned earlier, because of social media or from a third party, a trusted friend or family member, an employer, someone at drill weekend, someone in a unit, someone who's also a veteran. But many veterans may not show signs of intent to harm or kill themselves before doing so. And perhaps this is because veterans tend to have a very remarkable ability to handle a lot of stress, perhaps a lot more than most of us civilians. Resilience is very strong in veterans, and there's also a lot of stigma about getting help. There are behaviors that are warning signs that someone needs help, and when veterans are in crisis and show those behaviors, they could be at risk for hurting themselves. So some of those signs are here. These are common signs that would indicate that something's not right and that a trusted person or someone who cares should reach out. When someone is hopeless and feeling like there's no way out, or talking about life isn't worth living, those are clear warning signs. A shift in anxiety or agitation, sleeplessness or mood swings, again, feeling like there's no reason to live, having a lot of rage or anger, engaging in risky activities. We hear about this a lot from law enforcement. So someone that perhaps is drinking and driving, or someone who's not paying attention to driving laws, and someone goes to pull them over, like a police officer, and then they engage in some type of fight with police. We see the risky behaviors oftentimes being closely tied in with drugs and alcohol, and then withdrawing from friends or family. If any of these next warning signs are happening, this would really raise the concern that the person should get seen the same day. Someone who's thinking about killing themselves and looking for ways to die, that would be someone who you would come across that's really raging, that's really hard to calm down, maybe isn't responding to the typical ways that we would talk someone through a crisis. Someone who's talking a lot about death or dying and not able to engage with you in a conversation, or someone who's already hurt themselves, so self-destructive or risk-taking behaviors that have led to some harm. For example, someone that took an overdose and then once they woke up from sleeping, calls someone and tells them about it, especially in the context of drug or alcohol use, or if someone has a weapon and they're threatening self-harm. There are some specific risk factors for veterans that are different, of course, in the civilian population. Someone who's had frequent deployments to hostile environments, which would oftentimes mean frequent or recurrent exposure to extreme stress. Anyone who survived physical or sexual assault in the service, which we know happens to men and women. Someone who's had longer deployments, especially to a hostile environment, and then someone who has service-related injuries. So the A in Operation SAVE is asking the question. What's most important is that you get comfortable asking the question and being very direct about how you do that. Are you thinking about killing yourself? Have you had thoughts about taking your own life? Or are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you thinking about suicidal thoughts? All of these are examples of ways that you can ask someone the question very directly. Unfortunately, when we get anxious or we get worried about someone, it's very easy to think that we're asking them a question directly, and we're not. So for example, we've heard people tell us that they're really worried about someone, and so they asked the person if they were all right. And when the person said yes, then they felt like, okay, maybe they're not suicidal. And then something didn't sit right with them, so they end up calling the Veterans Crisis Line and talking to a responder. What we find is that people have that myth that if they use the word kill, if they use the word suicide, they're going to make the person more likely to say yes. They're going to somehow plant the seed. That's not true. We need to be very direct when we communicate, and that's the best way to communicate with our veterans, especially the ones who are in crisis. If we do not communicate directly about suicide, we oftentimes miss opportunities to get somebody help. So again, be very clear about how you ask the question. If, as I'm saying this to you, you feel uncomfortable or this feels like something that's really outside your experience, consider a role play. Consider talking to someone who's trusted and asking them these questions directly. In my position in mental health and suicide prevention for VA, I've had many opportunities to ask people these questions, and I've heard various responses. But what's also important is that you have time. So when we ask someone if they're thinking about suicide, that's not something that you do when you know you have to get off the phone the next minute. It's not something that a therapist should do in the last few minutes of a session. It's something that we do when we have time, and we ask the question also compassionately. These are ways that we can elicit someone to tell us the truth about how they're feeling and also show them that we can handle the response. So as I mentioned before, do ask the question if you've identified warning signs or symptoms. Do ask the question in a way that is natural and flows, and try not, as best you can, to negate the question when you ask it. So for example, like I mentioned before, if you're on FaceTime with a veteran who's in crisis and you're shaking your head no as you're asking them if they're having thoughts of suicide, that's sending a clear nonverbal message that you want them to say no. We also want to think about the tone that we use when we talk to someone who's at risk or in crisis. And I'll give you an example. If I say to you, "You aren't thinking of killing yourself, are you?" as opposed to, "I'm concerned about you. Are you having any thoughts of suicide?" We can send a lot about our own emotion, about our own ability to handle things, and also about our own judgment by how we ask this question. So don't wait to ask the question again until the person's leaving your office or until you know you have to jump off of the line. Even if you just have a couple minutes to offer someone after you ask them if they're having thoughts of suicide, it gives them the opportunity to share. Here are some things to consider and to really try to think about in the work that you're about to do with Objective Zero and its mission, but also if you find yourself talking to someone in crisis. Try to stay calm. There's ways that we can calm ourselves even if we're in a circumstance where we're supposed to be the helper. Some ways to do that are to take some deep breaths, to remember that you are there to help, and to not judge the person. So remaining calm really does matter. Listening more than you speak. When somebody's in crisis, they tend to be really talkative. In many ways, it's like if someone says that they just want to talk for a few minutes and then 30 minutes later, you find yourself still listening. People who are overwhelmed or people who are isolated oftentimes have not gotten things off of their chest, and the opportunity of a crisis gives them a chance to speak about a lot of things that have been on their mind. And it's remarkable how much people will share to a perfect stranger. If you have the opportunity to be in front of the person or via FaceTime, try to maintain eye contact. It also is a way that tends to show that you're paying attention and that you're not distracted. Act with confidence. Don't argue with someone, especially we don't argue at the VA about firearms. Use open body language as best you can. Again, around listening, try to limit your questions to what's necessary and be really ready to listen. Using supportive, encouraging comments, instilling hope, telling someone that that you care and that you want to see them get better and that you can help them get resources, and making sure that you're not lying about what those are. That's why we need to be honest, because there's no quick solutions, but help is always available. And as you've seen on these slides, we have a pretty repetitive emblem here with our brand for Veterans Crisis Line, which is available 24/7, irregardless of somebody's service history or discharge from the military. So validation goes a long way. We know this in our own lives and our own experience if we think about times where we had a really hard time and we reached out for help. When we validate someone, we make them feel more normal, and that's just a human response to crisis. So talking openly about suicide and being willing to listen really allow our veterans to express their own feelings. Recognizing that the situation is serious, but try not to judge them for whatever they're struggling with. And then again, reassuring that help is available. So encouraging treatment and expediting getting help. We would never want to negotiate with someone, by the way, who has a firearm out and who is threatening. At that point, if someone doesn't respond to our efforts to get them to calm down or to set their weapon down, we may have to involve local law enforcement. If you're working in a national network of trying to help people, just remember that if you call 911, you're calling your local 911. So you always want to try to find out where somebody is located when you're working with them on a national scale. We don't keep suicidal behavior or ideation secret. That's something that for some reason comes up a lot for people in crisis, especially if we're talking about an active duty service member who is very concerned about confidentiality or the impact on their career. There's always ways to get somebody help. And if you need help with that, you can call anonymously to the Veterans Crisis Line, which is also branded as the military helpline. But we don't leave somebody alone while they're in the crisis and they don't feel safe. One of the best ways to know if somebody feels safe is to ask them. And so if, again, someone's not doing well and they can't agree, or they tell you that they don't feel safe, or they can't agree to some type of safety plan, which is a mechanism that we use at VA for an intervention, then it may be time to get them to their local emergency room. All emergency rooms nationwide in the United States see anybody who walks in the door. Oftentimes there are crisis centers in someone's community who also offer walk-in capability to see someone in their local county. So reassuring the veteran that help is available is key. The Veterans Crisis Line can be a great in-between step. So for example, if you work with someone that you're concerned about and that call ended, or the FaceTime call ended, and you just want to run it by someone, it is okay to call the Veterans Crisis Line. And like I said earlier, callers can remain anonymous. So again, we don't negotiate with someone who's threatening with a weapon. We ask our local experts, oftentimes our local law enforcement, to talk about ways that they can negotiate with our veteran if that's necessary. If a veteran has already hurt themselves, it's really important that they get checked out. So again, if you talk to someone who references a recent suicide attempt and they have not been seen by a medical professional, it'd be really important for them to go get checked out. And again, the Veterans Crisis Line is available 24/7. It's the same number as the National Lifeline, 1-800-273-TALK or 8255. But in order to connect to the Veterans Crisis Line responders, you do need to press 1, and it does prompt you. If you're ever working with someone who leaves a facility, let's say they go get checked out or they had a suicide attempt and they've recently been out of the hospital, it'd be really great to let them know about the Crisis Line as a fallback mechanism in case they need help, and I'll share some additional resources with you as well. The VA Community Provider Toolkit is an online resource with a wealth of information that anyone can access anytime. There's different tabs. So for example, if someone is on this line today and doesn't have a lot of military culture training or is not a veteran or service member themselves but wants to help, there's some fantastic resources, all of which of course are free. Vet centers are community-based centers that the VA started many years back to provide readjustment counseling or other counseling services to veterans and service members who deployed to a combat zone. They also provide counseling services to family members who've lost a service member in duty or during the time of their service. And they also provide counseling for survivors of military sexual trauma. When we say community-based vet centers, these centers are not at the same place as a medical center campus. They're very purposely co-located in the community to try to decrease stigma. Make the Connection is also a fantastic resource that we have, and I'll show you a screenshot here in a minute. Make the Connection allows someone who perhaps is maybe not ready to get help or is not sure what would happen if they got help, and they want to hear some other stories. It's a video catalog of over 600 videos of veterans themselves speaking about their own experience of recovery and help seeking. You can actually search by gender, time of service, condition or struggle, so alcoholism or bipolar disorder. And through those search engines, you'll come up with a catalog of videos that you can watch. If you haven't seen this site, it's definitely worth checking out. There's a lot of peer-to-peer messaging that Make the Connection uses, which is more in line, I think, with the work that you all are doing with Objective Zero. We also have the National Center for PTSD that has some fantastic resources. If somebody does have PTSD, it's important to know that it's treatable and that treatment does work. Those of us that struggle with PTSD at times in our life, it may be worse than others, but we have some remarkable treatments, and we see people get better. And so it's really important to encourage folks to check out the resources that are here, including the PTSD Coach app. The VA has quite a few apps to help people deal with stress in the time that they need it most, which is very instant, and the reference is here. So I've mentioned the Veterans Crisis Line a few times. Just want to point out the website here. They do have text capabilities. When you text or when you chat online or when you call and talk to a responder, you're always reaching the same group. You're not reaching separate companies that manage those. So we have two call centers now. In November of 2016, our Atlanta, Georgia call center came online. The Veterans Crisis Line began in 2007 with less than 20 responders. We now have more than 500 in Canandaigua, New York, and Atlanta, Georgia. I also have a reference here to share with you, which is a website through the Veterans Crisis Line. If you click on the tab Resource Locator, which tends to be to the right side of the screen, you can put in your zip code or the zip code of a veteran that you're talking to or service member that you're talking to. And it will pop up resources in their area, and it will show you the closest by mileage to the zip code that you enter. So for example, those of us that are suicide prevention coordinators, we are at every VA medical center nationally. There's over 300 in the VA system. And our role is to provide education and training in the community, to respond to veterans who call the crisis line, and the next business day, we attempt to reach veterans, their family members, or service members 3 times. And the goal is that once the crisis has been resolved with the crisis line directly, we really want to load the person up with resources. We want to instill hope. We want to encourage them to engage in care and treatment, whether that's with VA or not. So these are folks who have expertise about their community and what the community has to offer veterans, as well as can help with the VA. Here's a screenshot of Make the Connection, which I mentioned earlier. I'm going to now turn over the presentation to Madrienne Wong. She's on my team, and as I mentioned earlier, we work for the Public and Private Partnerships team.
Thanks, Amy. Hi, everyone. This is Madrienne. And first of all, I just want to thank you so much for the work that you're going to embark on with Objective Zero. It's really important work and can be really complex. I want to inform you about some other VA call lines that exist and are available to you as resources. So my first job in VA, as it mentions on this title page, 6 years ago, was with the National VA Call Line Coaching into Care when it was brand new. And so I know what it feels like to have those jangling nerves waiting for the phone to ring and not really knowing what's going to come in on the other line. And so in thinking about that, when somebody is contacting Objective Zero, there's likely many different factors that could be contributing to their struggles. And oftentimes people will want to talk about any and all of them. So I wanted to let you all know that you don't have to be the expert in every realm of help that is available to veterans through VA. And so I wanted to tell you about each of the ones that I became aware of through my work with Coaching into Care. And these slides will be available to you, so you'll have all of the phone numbers for reference or referral as you need them. So if you'd go back, Amy, one slide, I'll talk a little bit about Coaching into Care. So this is the VA calling that I'm the most familiar with because it's the one that I worked on. And it's unique in that it is available to family members, friends, and acquaintances. So those who may be contacting Objective Zero but are not veterans themselves, who are concerned about a veteran. And Coaching into Care responders can assist with navigating different VA entry points that can be confusing sometimes. It's a big system, and we want people to be able to access care and have that be accessible to them. So the responders are trained in helping people navigate the system, and they also can provide resources and referrals for callers themselves to get support, and for veterans too. They also provide a coaching service that uses motivational interviewing techniques in order to help veterans seek the help that they need, and for family members to use sort of non-coercive language and techniques. And Coaching into Care is open 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Time, but if anyone calls outside of those hours and leaves a message, somebody will contact them back. Okay, next slide, please, Amy. Another call line that is available to family members and others, self-identified caregivers of veterans, is the Caregiver Support Line. And they have really caring, compassionate staff who can connect callers to their local caregiver support coordinator. There is at least one caregiver support coordinator at every VA hospital. And that person has expertise on eligibility for caregiver benefits and is also aware of local support services in VA and their local community. And their hours are listed here as well. So another VA call line that exists that works in partnership with the Veterans Crisis Line is the National Call Center for Homeless Veterans. And this call line is geared towards veterans themselves. Like the Caregiver Support Line, this call line can connect callers to their local homeless veterans coordinator, of which there is one in every VA hospital. And that person has expertise in VA homeless benefits and local homeless services in and outside of VA. There's also the Combat Veterans Line that is available to veterans, which is geared towards combat veterans and their family members. And this calling is really focused on the struggles of readjustment, however the caller defines that. And it's staffed by combat veterans and family members. So we often would refer veterans and their family members to this line if they wanted to speak to somebody that they could relate to. And who might have experienced similar readjustment issues to them. And they're open 24/7. Next, please. And last but not least, certainly, is a call line that Amy had already mentioned, which is the Veterans Crisis Line. And the phone number that is listed at the top is the same crisis line that is available for everybody, civilians alike. And then when you hear the menu, then you can press 1 for veterans, and it reroutes to the Veterans Crisis Line. So Suicide Prevention Lifeline, in conjunction with the Veterans Crisis Line, has the same phone number, but pressing 1 gets you specifically to the VCL. They also have a chat service that is available, and it's the same responders that will respond to the chat in similar ways as they would on the phone. Callers can request to speak with a veteran. The Veterans Crisis Line makes sure to have veterans on staff in case somebody feels more comfortable talking with somebody who served. They also have an ability that is different from all of the other call-ins that I've mentioned, which is that they're able to triangulate call location and send out emergency services, even if somebody hasn't said where it is that they're calling from. Calls that come into the Veterans Crisis Line are documented in patients' electronic medical records. And responders on the Veterans Crisis Line can connect to their local suicide prevention coordinator, who also is aware of services and resources that are available in their local community. And they are also available to us 24/7. So just to conclude, my portion of the different call-ins that are available, I'd like you all to think about VA and each of these call-ins as your ally in our shared goals of preventing veteran suicide and improving the lives and well-being of veterans and their family members. So each of these call-ins exists to serve our veterans, and we want you to utilize them as resources.
Thanks, Madrian. So before we take questions, just remember that Operation SAVE stands for Signs of Suicidal Thinking That Should Be Recognized, asking the most important question of all, validating the veteran's experience, encouraging treatment, and expediting someone to get help. So hopefully today we've met some of our objectives that we had laid out, and we have some references to share with you as well. And I think now would be a good time to take any questions. If anybody wants to unmute themselves, I just checked the text box and I don't think there were any questions there unless I missed something. But again, please unmute yourself and feel free to ask any questions and we'll do our best to answer.
Hi, Amy. Blake Bassett here. What should an ambassador do if they're on the phone through the Objective Zero app with a veteran and the veteran says, I'm prepared to kill myself, I have a gun to my head right now? What would you recommend the ambassador do?
Sure. I think having a response as calm as possible to say, I'm so glad that you told me that. Can you just set the gun down so we can talk? And usually what happens is, someone will either agree to that and they start crying usually, or the person just kind of stays at the same level of agitation. And that's where you have to make a decision really quickly. And what's probably a good idea too, and I'm glad you asked the question, Blake, is in the work that I do doing crisis mental health work with veterans, I have a phone that allows me to have multiple lines. So for example, if you had just said that to me on the phone now, what I could do is put you on speaker and mute you after asking you a question, while I then go start a second line without you hearing it because of the use of mute. And I think some people are better at managing their smartphone than others about how to do that. But it's probably a good idea that if you're going to take a call through the Objective Zero app, that you always be thinking about what's the nearest phone line to use as a backup, or where someone nearby. If you were stuck by yourself in that scenario, what you would do is you would ask that question, encourage the person to set the gun down so that you can talk and get them help. And then they'll tell you, or you'll be able to, decipher from their response. Usually someone who's reaching out in a situation like that is going to respond to getting help because they're ambivalent. They don't really want to die. They just want the pain to end. And the terrible problem with suicide is that when people have access to something that's so lethal, it just makes for a bad situation really fast. So what you could do with your smartphone is you could tap speaker and you could tap mute, and you could, on most phones, dial out to an external line as well. Another option would be you could try to do a three-way to the Veterans Crisis Line if you have no idea where that person is. If you know where that person is located, it would be best to try to reach out to local emergency services. And some of that, I guess, would be determined by how your app connects people. If it shows them a physical location of where they are, then that makes it easier because, for example, when somebody calls me in crisis, I have to determine, and which I do at the beginning of the call as fast as I can, who they are and where they are. Whether they're a veteran, how long they serve, what branch, that is all secondary information to me as a crisis responder. I want to know who they are and where they are, because if I need to go a step further, then I know, for example, which county I need to look up for emergency dispatch, which you can do on Google anytime.
This is Phil Torn. I have a question, and this is kind of twofold for VA and maybe the app. But from the VA perspective and experience with suicide and veterans, when there's an opportunity to make contact with someone not physically, but like in person? Is that recommended, or is there any sort of like advice against that or for that? And then also, I guess, would be for on the app end, is that not really what the goal is? And is that not logistically what the goal is even close to accomplishing? Like, it's not based on we've already covered that. It's not geographically going to show you where people are, connect you with people near you, but, you know, just any thoughts on that?
Hi, thanks. This is Amy. Let me just hit a couple of bullet points and I'll answer that question. The data that was referenced earlier, the most recent data report, which you see here on the reference slide, shows you reference to our 2016 Suicide Among Veterans and Other Americans data report. I'd encourage you, if you have data-related questions, to take a peek at that. Even just the first 4 pages will give you some highlights. But that's where we released data that said that it's actually 20 veterans who die each day by suicide is the best estimate. Of those 20, 14 are not enrolled and receiving care with VA at the time of their death or within 2 years of their death. So of the 26 veterans are enrolled and receiving care within VA. We know a lot about the 6. We don't know a lot about the 14. We absolutely need outside partners. The VA will not be able to get to 0 on our own. We know that. And so we have various avenues for trying to increase our reach, elevating suicide prevention for veterans as a priority in public health outreach. And the more that we can do, the better. We also need the civilians that on this call, but also just in the communities at large, to take some responsibility for veteran suicide prevention. So with that said, to answer your question, here's what I can tell you. We don't do house calls. So if somebody contacts the Veterans Crisis Line, they absolutely will get contact. And that contact will either be through their text, their chat online, or by phone. We always prefer to talk to people, those of us doing crisis mental health work, on the phone. It's easier to understand their affect and to determine if they're intoxicated, for example, which actually does not lower their risk, right? If they're intoxicated, it increases the risk of impulsivity. But it's just easier to engage with someone. So if that someone says, hey, can you just come and talk to me at my house? We just don't do that for some of the earlier stated risks. But what I can tell you is this: increasing contact with someone who is not doing well is the answer. So enhancing their connectedness to others. There was a question in the chat box earlier about how to engage older veterans and how to get them to kind of come out of their shell. Same thing, we've got to find ways to reach people. If the app can be used, for example, on iPads, and there's a way to reach out to senior centers through maybe VFWs or other organizations that have a better reach to some of our older veterans, that would be a great way. But as far as meeting up with someone, what I can tell you is at VA, we don't do that. There are programs where we do go see someone in their home. So we have a program for people with intensive mental health needs that provides actually house calls. But the way that program starts off is the person's determined as having a high level of need based on the frequency of their contact with our healthcare system. And then typically the first meeting happens in a healthcare setting. And then there's some follow-up efforts to find out who they live with and meet with the person in advance to go into their home. And then our housing program does a lot of outreach and is actually responsible for getting people off the street, hopefully into stabilized housing. And most of the time that they're going to meet up with someone before that first contact, they're going to meet them at a coffee shop or in a public setting, if the person didn't walk into one of our own homeless walk-in clinics. So the message, I think, is that it sounds like Objective Zero will give you their own direction, but I can tell you as VA clinicians, even in the programs where you can get home visits, there's various levels of assessment that go into that before the first visit happens. When family members call the crisis line and sometimes just want their veteran to be picked up and they just need some respite, or they just want the person to go away because there's been a lot of crisis, what we explain to them is we don't have a van that'll come pick you up just to take you away. We do have transportation to medical appointments, but let's just talk through the crisis. And then lastly, I'll say, it sounds like there'll be an opportunity where people may come across you where you build a bond, or maybe you were in the same unit, or there's some connection that you feel comfortable pursuing. There's many nonprofits that do the type of work of like unit reunions or things like that, where they bring people back together, and they have their own kind of strategies for what they tell their volunteers. But hopefully that helped answer some of your question.
What would you suggest if the veteran denies being suicidal but is showing the symptoms?
Oh, right. Thank you. What I would suggest is increasing their contact with others. So, for example, if that question's coming out of the role of being a caregiver, trying to find people in their community or network that can increase contact, and just share your concern that you want to see the person get better. Maybe reflect to the person what you're noticing. Because sometimes it's really hard when you're, for example, depression is a chemical imbalance, and for those of us that struggle with that, it can be really hard to see what other people see. But what we find from a medical standpoint, mental health standpoint, and just from a system, we increase our contact with someone who we're concerned about. And what I mean by that is that could be any type of caring contact. So if we have someone that we deem high risk, for example, within our healthcare system, we want to see them weekly, face-to-face, preferably for treatment. If they say no, or it's a burden on us financially to get there, we'll settle for phone calls. We'll do safety plans with people. But what we want to do is increase weekly contact. So at minimum, having that person in touch with someone outside of themselves who's a positive support on a weekly basis. Text messaging, works for some people, but we like to take it a step further and have some type of either phone calls or visits. We call them mood checks if they're done over the phone, just quick phone calls to say, hey, I'm concerned about you. I wanted to know how you're doing and if you're having a better day today. And it's remarkable how responsive people are when you just very directly state your concern for them. When people get agitated by that, that's oftentimes a sign that there may be something else going on, like an increase in substance abuse, marijuana, alcohol, something else, or that they're having more symptoms that are really tough to handle, and then we try to reach out to someone who's close to that person. So the short answer is increasing contact, and then trying to encourage treatment, of course, but we understand that no one can force someone else to care.